Vengeance of God, how much you ought to terrify every reader of what I saw now. I say we saw a level plain, only not a plant grew there. The wood of misery garlands it. Over all the desert, slowly falling, it rained broad flakes of fire. So the eternal ardor fell here, and it lit the sand like tinder lit by flints, doubling the pain. There was no declining the dance of their poor hands, here, there, fending away the fresh fire falls. Dante, led by Virgil, has arrived in a new hell compartment. The dwellers here are still Dante's violent souls, like the suicides and the tyrants we have seen, but here we find scorners of God. And the lines that we just heard, that a wood of misery garlands this plain. We see this circle shape. We're reminded of the shape of the Inferno. The words here are that every reader ought to be terrified of what is reported here. He's telling us not to so hastily recuse ourselves with the assumption that the sin we see here is not our own. It's interesting. Dante did this back in Canto 7. He does not do this at every compartment. We know we're not tyrants. And he probably thinks he can trust us to decide for ourselves if we're gluttons or if we're lustful. Here, it would seem that Dante is letting us know that we are dealing with a more mysterious, more difficult to pinpoint sin. And this reminds me of some words in Goethe's Faust which pertain simultaneously, I think, to both the redemption and to the inherent flaw of man. Here are the words: Freude dem Sterblichen, joy to the mortal, denn die verderblichen, schleichenden erblichen Mängel umwanden. Now the Peter Psalm translation of this is joy to all men, mortal and frail, enmeshed in silent inherited failings. Now my German is not great, but I think that last word, umwanden, is something similar to when Dante says garlands, in reference to the brook that circumvallates the sinners in Canto 14. I think when Goethe says umwanden, he really means something more like wreathed. The mortal man is enwreathed with his sins. I say this because the German word for to wreath is winden. Past tense, I believe it would be wanden. Our own sins wreath us. Our Mangel, our flaws, our defects, our schleichenden Mangel. Our flaws can be subtle and sneaking, and they can lie in wait within us for circumstance or fate to exploit our latent flaws. So what is this sneaking, potentially latent sin that we're going to be dealing with here in Canto 14? It is to make a blasphemous assault on God by over-pursuing worldly glory. And I want to read one other line from Goethe that actually sums up the point of this entire canto. The line is spoken by God himself. Es irrt der Mensch, solange strebt. Man will stray so long as he strives. So the sin is what Goethe would call streben and what Dante would call disdaino de Dio, disdain of God or blasphemy. So in this region, God's vengeance is dispensed in one of its most classic forms, a smiting from above, like the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Looking at one man in particular, Dante asks Virgil, who is that he-man, seeming to scorn the fire and writhing in disdain, as if the rain couldn't ripen him? So that's the Ellis translation. The rain couldn't ripen him, as in his scorn seems to include nature herself. Is not just blasphemy against the gods. There is nothing sacred enough or natural enough for this blasphemer to accept any dictate other than his own will. And it turns out to be Capaneus. And this man, Virgil explains, was one of the 7 kings besieging Thebes, a scorner of God. The war against Thebes is an ancient Greek episode, and it is the subject of an epic poem by a man named Statius, a 1st century Roman poet. Statius is important to Dante, and Statius himself makes an appearance in Purgatory, so he really is second only to Virgil in Dante's esteem. So let's discuss Book 10 of Statius's Thebaid, which results in the death of Capaneus, there are two plot points that emphasize his role as a blasphemer. Jove's favor is turned away from the Grecians. We know as readers that Thebes will not fall to these armies. So it's known to us. Fate is against the besieging army of which Capaneus is a part. And the second thing that happens before Capaneus dies is this very remarkable and beautiful description of a young man who sacrifices himself because he is told that the gods demand his life in order to save his home city. So he's the opposite of a blasphemer. He is pious. His name is Menoeceus. He represents piety. Statius describes this entire scene with incredibly touching language, beginning with the divine aid he receives from the goddess Virtue. He is touched by the goddess Virtue, close companion of the throne of Jove. She assured his wavering mind with the silent touch of her mighty hand, and left herself within his heart. No more swiftly does the cypress blasted by lightning flash drink up the deadly flame from stem to summit than did the youth, possessed by the mighty deity, raise high his spirit and fall straight in love with death. Then he goes to the chosen part of the wall, sacred already to behold, and majestic in mien beyond his wont, as though suddenly descended to earth from heaven above, bareheaded and manifest to view, he gazed down upon the lines of warriors and stilled the clamors of the field and bade the war be silent. This is the moment of his sacrifice. In describing the tower as sacred before the deed is even done, makes it an obviation to all who can see him. The word manifest. It is obvious that he has the blessing of the gods, that his appointment as the martyr who redeems Thebes is so clear. It fits then that this is a precursor to the blasphemy of the besiegers. They can see for themselves what fate has in store. And Menoeceus stabs himself, and Statius writes, with his blood he sprinkled the towers and purified the walls, and grasping still his sword, hurled himself into the midst of the lines. Piety and virtue clasped, and bore his body lightly to the earth, for his spirit long since is at the throne of Jove, and demands for itself a crown midst the stars. This young man did not lead a perfect life. That's why Statius includes these lines. In his last act, he actually did try to continue to wage war against the besieging Grecians. He tried to land on them, but he couldn't, because piety and virtue clasped and guided him to the earth while his soul went to heaven. What is interesting about this, it's time to go back to those words from Goethe. I had said this was not just about our sins, it is also about our redemption. Verderblichen is the word that I think is meant to be translated as perishable. And this word verderblichen is being used in the same stanza as sterblichen, as in mortal, and Mängel, our failings and our mortality. And both mortal man and whatever defects he possesses are perishable, which is to say, our corruptible flaws are also mortal. Even if we are imperfect, if we are basically virtuous, then on the day we die, our souls will leave our moral weaknesses in the dust behind it, along with our flesh, and take its spot in heaven. And returning to those lines from Statius in Canto 10 of the Thebaid, long since are the words. His spirit is long since at the throne of Jove. It speaks to fate. And it is in contrast to this beautiful image of piety that blasphemous Capaneus will climb the very same wall on which Menoeceus had sacrificed himself. Statius writes, he, as in Capaneus, unmoved by missiles assailing him in front or rear, hovers aloft in empty air. And now he sounds like Dante's Capaneus, defying the righteous penal fire from above in the Inferno. And once he mounts that spire, Statius describes him like an animal. He falls with foot and hand upon the masonry and fiercely destroys the jointing and the flooring that would stay him, landing on all fours in destruction of the civilized ramparts. This also fits with Dante, who told us that this region of hell is reserved for men guilty of behaving like beasts. So high does Capaneus climb that his voice reaches the clamoring Olympian host. Statius writes, "In mid-heaven Capaneus was heard. Are there no gods among you," he cries, "who stand for panic-stricken Thebes?" The Latin itself has his taunt beginning with "Nolane pro trepidis." And as the reader begins this statement with this clause, if you're a Latin reader, the words that begin this sentence are more like "none for the weak." Upon this site, where a young man has just taken his own life for his home city, whose walls he has purified with his blood, upon witnessing this act, Capaneus looks to heaven and would say, "None for the weak," even though he has just seen with his own eyes that the inhabitants of this city have been redeemed and do enjoy the favor of the gods. This is an out-of-touch, dumb blasphemer. So forceful is this taunt that the gods are struck in fear. Statius writes, "When they see the hero stand midway in the dizzy height of air and summon them to insane battle, they marvel in silence and grow pale, doubting the thunderbolt's power." He's so sure of himself that the lesser Olympian deities who are beneath Jove are afraid. But Capaneus does not even finish his last words, so swift is his death. Statius writes, "Even as he spoke, the thunderbolt struck him." And now here he is in hell, returning to the Dante, unwilling even in death to submit to fate. And not only that, he thinks he is the divinity that should dispense justice. Listen to these lines, referring to the day of his death. "Just as at the battle of Phlegra, if he," and that he is as in Jupiter, "if he shot all his strength at me, he'd never be happy in revenge." Even in hell, this is Capaneus attempting to use the language of a prophet, referencing Jupiter as if Jupiter is the blasphemer who is in a hell of his own torments. It's pretty incredible. That is the extent of Capaneus's blasphemy. As Virgil says in response, you heard it from his own lips, basically is what Virgil says. His own oaths are the right metals for his chest. So as we move on from this moment, the next thing that we see does not involve a sinner, but rather it cuts to something deeper than this one person, Capaneus. And that is the notion of an ever-shifting fortune that is outside of the control of an individual, and to accept the certainty that the fortune of nations is doomed. Virgil leads Dante to a brook. This is what Virgil says to Dante, line 85. "Among all that I've shown you since we came through the gate, your eyes haven't seen anything as worth noting as this beck. There's a ruined spot in mid-sea," he begins, "that's known as Crete. Its king once ruled a pure world. There's a mountain there called Ida, once an idyll of watery glades, now hoary in its total desertion. In the mountain stands an ancient, vast in size, his face facing Rome, his back turned towards Damietta. Everything is split by a fissure that drips tears that collect and bore the rock. And by the way, these watery tears, Dante had already told us, were of such a bloody color that it still unnerves me to this day. They drop here from level to level, making Acheron, Styx, Phlegethon, then down along this tight canal until there's no further to fall." When we see these lines, that this ancient, and this of course is a statue, that the statue of this ancient was once facing Egypt, that is to say, Damietta, and it rotated towards each different city as it ruled the world, and now it faces Rome. We get this rotational imagery here in the circular inferno, a sense of constantly revolving and rotating fortunes, and that one day it will rotate again. We also get the sense that every time it turns, this fissure rips, and water drips from it like tears, and those tears, as we see, drip down through the earth and they irrigate hell. Hell is watered by the blasphemous cataclysms of human history.